Hello everyone, I'm Sylvia from fairlightarot. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to have a look at Mirror or Yin and Yang decks, a VR to Meredith from the Oasis Spiritual Empowerment Tarot. I don't know if you can tell from my voice, but I'm sick. So I've been sick for a couple of days, and that's why I've had a couple of days of delay in posting my videos. I'm not 100% yet, but I just want to shake it off. So I'm just gonna live as if I was perfectly fine and do all of the things that I do every day. Let's see how it goes. So this tag is all about decks that are very similar to each other aesthetically, but once you get to use them, you'll see that they have very distinct or sometimes even opposite energies. And I really liked this video. I thought it was really so much fun. I have seen it first on Sharon's channel from Trio Witches Tarot, so I'll link her video in the description box below. And then I went and watched Meredith's video too. And I think that I've wanted to do a video like this for a while now, because I do believe that at least what I do is sometimes I actually select my tarot decks working together depending on aesthetics and energies. And I've noticed that many times, that sometimes there could be aesthetically pleasing and very similar decks that have completely different energies. And I thought, I wonder if other people see these things the same way I see them. And it's always very interesting to me to see how other people choose the decks they're working with, if they choose them for their energies or they choose them for their aesthetics or both. And I think that this is a very important part of our practice, whether we do read tarot only for ourselves, for our self-improvement or our growth, or we read tarot for customers. We always have to be responsible for the choices we make. We always have to have a very specific reason why to use one deck rather than another, or at least that's the way I feel. But let me know what you feel in the comments below. I am so pleased that more of you are watching my videos and more of you are subscribing. Thank you so much for that. It really helps. And I also love it when there's this communication going with the comments. It really makes me happy. So let's have a look at these decks. Okay, so what do we got? We've got the Wild Unknown Tarot by Kim Krantz, the Sacred Web it's been written by Jenny Brown and illustrated by her son James Brown IV. Then we've got the third edition of the Naked Heart by Gillian C. Wilde. Now we've got I think it's the first edition of the Lumina. It's the indie edition in any case of the Lumina Tarot by Inner Hue. And then we've got the Way Home Tarot by Bacana Wintner and Autumn Whitehurst. I generally look at these decks and think to myself that they definitely share a common theme in the aesthetics, but let's have a look why. Okay, so what have we got here? We've got, as we've seen, the Wild Unknown, we've got the Sacred Web, we've got the Naked Heart, we've got the Way Home Tarot and the Lumina Tarot. As you can see, they're all different heights. Obviously, that depends on the cardstock. I think my favorite one out of all these ones is definitely the Naked Heart. It is my kind of, matte battery feel kind of finish, which I really appreciate. The Way Home is kind of a thinner side, but it's very flexible. It's definitely built for a lot of use. At least that's the way I feel it. Whereas, for example, when we look at the Lumina, it's more papery. That's what it feels to me like, more cardboardy. Definitely the Wild Unknown, sorry, is definitely more papery. And to get to the last one, the Sacred Web is definitely paper. To the point that I've seen a lot of people complain about the cardstock in this deck. I'm not too happy about it either. However, this deck is so fantastic that I actually don't mind. Of course, I wish they were reprinting with different cardstock, but you never know. It's just that I don't see this deck a lot Correct me if I'm wrong, the Sacred Web Tarot, it's something that I have never seen it on Instagram, never seen it on YouTube, unless you specifically search for it, and even so, there's not that many around. I think the concept is fantastic, and it's the journey towards a healing by the son. So James, he's basically had a very debilitating accident, and he had to get back to health, and in order to do so, he started drawing tarot cards. And the first one that he drew was the Death card, which he called release, and this way he was releasing all the constraints and the pain and the despair that were linked to his accident. For this reason, I think that this deck is very deep. But let's talk about the energies of these decks in general. So what I'm going to do, obviously with 5 decks it's not that easy, but what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you the cards, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about the decks at the same time. So what we can tell is that these 5 decks share a very distinct, let's say, art style. They are very similar, not just in the fact that, you know, they have a lot of white spaces, for example. They have a very excellent use of the juxtaposition between the white and the black colors. They indeed use a minimalistic style. They also, in some cases, they're very peepish. In some others, they're not peepish, but they're fully illustrated, but they're not necessarily illustrated in the traditional way of the RWS. And I really do believe that when you start working with them, you realize, though, that the energies that they convey and they channel are actually quite different. So to me, one thing that jumps to my attention is, for example, the fact that the Naked Heart Tarot has a wonderful use of elements and symbols. You can tell by the fact that, for example, it does show the symbol of the element itself on the card. Something that you can partly see, for example, in the Lumina. The Lumina will have some symbology, but the Lumina uses symbols in a different way. The Lumina is more of a sigil kind of deck. I don't know if you understand what I mean with that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it shows you sigils. There are different decks that do that, but it uses symbology in a way that is actually evocative, whereas, for example, in my opinion, the Naked Heart uses symbologies in a way that is more didascalic. So it's explanatory. It gives you the idea of what the energy of this suit is, and it's opening up you know, your intuition. It's a way to help you understand the meaning of the cards or make associations. And this to me is something that is quite different. The Lumina doesn't do that. The Lumina uses symbols, sometimes even sigils, in its own way to be evocative. Another difference between the other decks, for example, is that, as you can see, the Wild Unknown, it's probably one that sets itself apart from the others when it comes to art style, because it does have a different use of the line work. So the line work in the Wild Unknown is actually used to create depth of focus. So you've got a certain amount of line strokes that are very useful to give that 3D kind of air, kind of perspective. Whereas the other 4 don't exactly do that. There's a very neat line work in the Naked Heart. There's a bit of a both, so neat line, but also depth of field in the Sacred Web. Whereas we don't have that in the Way Home. The Way Home is definitely a deck that has very neat lines, and in some, I reckon that the When it comes to the lumina, for example, we do achieve depth of field, but it's mostly achieved by the shading used by watercoloring in many cards. It's actually really beautiful, and it's let me tell you, it's not easy. So I used to work with graphics all the time, and I'm a very curious person, so I would actually ask them, you know, how do you achieve this and how do I achieve that? Because in photography it's something completely different, of course. And they explained to me that you know, achieving depth of field with watercolors requires a lot of skills, and I do admire that in this deck. So this is, to me, the main differences. The use of symbology is different. The use of the line work in some cases to give depth of field, or the use of watercolor to give depth of field is different. The way in which, for example, I feel like the wild unknown refers to very earthy kind of energies, whereas the sacred web is more of an airy kind of deck. And I don't know if you agree, because it's something that I believe, unless it's specifically explained in the guidebook or in the process of creating the deck, you will not necessarily share the same opinion as mine on the elemental energies of these decks. To me, the Naked Heart is very impartial, is very balanced when it comes to energies. And the Lumina, for example, is a very earthy kind of deck. When it comes to the Way Home, to me, it's a watery deck. I know I say that while looking at the Son of Cups, which is obviously from the Suit of Water. But I believe that the rest of the deck is very watery and expresses that kind of feelings, introspection into the feelings that you would expect from a watery deck. As I said before, this is really personal. I think that it would be very nice to confront my opinion with yours, in the sense that nothing is set in stone. I keep on saying that. It's one of my favorite sentences, because I believe that everyone has got the right to change their mind, and I'm always very grateful to confront myself with others' opinions. That's why I love traveling, because it's a way for myself to improve my point of view, improve my awareness, improve my intuition as well. If you do think that these decks behave in a different way from what I've talked about so far, please let me know in the comments below. So we had a look at these decks, and just to summarize, this is the Wild Unknown, this is the Sacred Web, the Naked Heart, the Way Home Tarot, and the Lumina Tarot. The next two decks that I want to show you are the Radiant Wilds Tarot by Nat Gisberger and the Serpent Fire Tarot by Devani Wolf. I think that these two decks have a very similar color palette. They have a very similar kind of settings, you know, photographic collage in the desert, but they actually do not share the same energy at all. Let's have a look. So we've got this is the 7th edition, by the way, of the Serpent Fire. And I think it has been confirmed that Devani does not mean to reprint. And so I think there's still a few shops that have this deck available. But not necessarily, you know, I don't know about the stock availability, how many there will be in stock. What I do recommend is, if you like it, absolutely just go for it, because you know, it might not be available anymore. So let's have a look. I think I can actually zoom in here. There you go. So as I was saying, these two decks are very similar, in the sense that as you can tell, the color palette, as I was saying before, is very similar. They're both digital collage decks, and they do share a lot of the same imagery and symbols as well, and which is not necessarily a given, in the sense that in some cases I feel like the desert, the theme of pairing up desert and Egyptian symbology has been a bit, probably become a bit of a cliche. However, let's not forget that the Serpent Fire is on its 7th edition, which means that what Devani was doing since the beginning was associating these two themes when it was not necessarily something that was already done. What I do feel is that these two decks, even though they really they do look very, very similar, they share two completely different energies. So when I look at them, I feel that there's a lot of earthy energy, fiery energy coming from the serpent fire, not just because of the name, of course. So the serpent or the snake is the Kundalini, always referring to the sacred energy that we have in the center of our body, and it's something that as a consequence really touches base with our true core self, our raw selves as well. Whereas, for example, the Radiant Wilds to me is a deck that it does share that fiery energy because mostly of the elements of the color palette. So we've got a lot of burnt oranges and reds and yellows. But somehow to me, the Serpent Fire feels more cosmic in a way rather than the Radiant Wilds. The Radiant Wilds in some way is really anchored to earth. It's the kind of as above, so below that we can see in many decks. I really love the imagery on both of them. I really love the fact that there's animals, there's people, there's objects. There's natural phenomena, for example. Coincidentally, they share a very, very similar cardstock. These are the backs, by the way. I'm not sure I showed the backs on the other decks. I have to be honest, when I bought the Radiant Wilds, I already had a Serpent Fire and I just stopped completely. I stopped using the Serpent Fire because I felt that the Radiant Wilds was kind of replacing the Serpent Fire in a way that it felt even more complete to me. However, I was mistaken because I realized very soon that it was the reason why I felt that way was because I was going through a period of time in which I really needed to be grounded. And I didn't necessarily feel grounded whenever I was using a Serpent Fire. So I thought, well, okay, in this case, I'm just going to stick to the Radiant Wilds because it is grounding me. And it's because the Serpent Fire has that kind of energy, the cosmic intuition, that cosmic projection that you see in many of the cards. But then I realized that indeed, whenever I went through this period of time in which I needed to be grounded, I actually started missing the way in which the Serpent Fire is making me feel whenever I used it, the kind of intuition that was triggering in me, the thoughts that came to my mind, and the kind of meditation that I could do thanks to these cards. And so that's my way of seeing these two decks as very, very similar in, you know, color palette for sure, but also the use of images, the fact that they are both digital collages, the fact that they are both based on scenes in the desert, for example. But I am very well aware now that I know both of them enough that they do have two different kind of energies. And as I said, this is more for grounding, so and so below, and a cosmic kind of feel that comes from the Serpent Fire that makes me think of it as an as above kind of deck. It's funny how some of these images are so very similar. It's crazy, isn't it? And I thought about having a third deck here, even a fourth one, for example, because color palettes of the Mystic Mondays are very, very similar to the Radiant Wilds. And also the Muse Tarot by Chris and Donnelly to me is quite similar to the Serpent Fire. But I think that these two are, there are shades of differences in the other two, the Muse and the Mystic Mondays, where, for example, these two actually do present in a more clear way the difference of energy that I can feel coming out of them. So this is, again, the Serpent Fire Tarot, and this is the Radiant Wilds Tarot. The next two decks that I think the whole tarot community would agree, they look very similar when it comes to aesthetics, are the Mystical Moments by Catherine Beth Stein and Liz Houston's Dream Keeper's Tarot. This is the indie edition, by the way. I'm very happy that I've got this one because of the cardstock. It's an excellent cardstock, and I think the font at the bottom is also different from the mass market edition. Not that I would mind having the mass market edition. As a matter of fact, I think the guidebook in the mass market edition may be even a bit more complete. I seem to remember that there might be one or two additional paragraph when it comes to the description of the cards, but that's not very important. What I really like about both these decks is the kind of whimsical, surreal kind of art that they show. And size aside, because obviously the Mystical Moment is rather large, it's actually large for any kind of deck, tarot decks, as you can tell. So this is the Dream Keepers has a standard tarot deck size, whereas the Mystical Moment, as you can see, it's slightly larger. It doesn't bother me, but it is borderline for me, almost impossible to shuffle or to riffle shuffle. Of course, I think I can still overhand shuffle it. Whereas I really appreciate the Dream Keepers Tarot for this reason as well. So as I was saying, they do share that kind of surreal type of art. I am forever on the hunt for the Leonora Carrington's tarot. So Leonora Carrington's was a very major representative of surreal art from the beginning of last century, and she was actually really interested in the occult, and she actually created a tarot deck. I think it was the majors only. Originally, that deck was printed by Forgal Press in the UK. It has been, I think it's out of print. That's why it's very difficult to find. But I've heard, so I follow the Leonora Carrington's estates page on Instagram, and they were mentioning that there's a new editor that has agreed to reprint it. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that one day I'll be able to have a look at it. It's if you haven't seen it, you can Google it. It's very beautiful. And her art style is exactly like this. So there's a lot of surreal elements. One of the main differences that comes to my attention is that we've got a more distinct kind of almost photographic style in the Dream Keeper. So this looks more like a collage rather than the paintings of the Mystical Moments. But that's just the kind of method used for this kind of art style, because if you actually look at the images, they have that kind of very similar sense of not real, so hence the term surreal. I really enjoy these two decks. As a matter of fact, you all know that the Mystical Moments has an oracle deck as well, which has a very by the same author and obviously with the same kind of style. And but because it's got a matte cardstock as opposed to the very glossy one of the Mystical Moment Tarot, which is by default, every time I look for a reference to talk about a very glossy tarot deck, this is the one that comes to mind all the time. So as you can tell, I'm not too happy about it. I think it's such a pity that they changed the cardstock. So I think that the oracle came first, and they actually used a very good matte finish, which pairs really well with the matte finish of the indie edition of the Dream Keepers Tarot. Therefore, I do tend to pair those two up together more often than I do with the Mystical Moment Tarot. Let's have a look at the differences. What I feel is that the Mystical Moment really lifts me up. It's not necessarily as in lifting my humor. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is that whenever I'm, for example, reading a book, there are sentences that lift me up from the book. So they take me away from the plot, and they make me travel, they make me think about something else. This is exactly what this deck does to me. Whenever I'm reading with the mystical moment, because of the images being so quirky and surreal and whimsical at times, they distract me from the actual meaning of the word. Of course, there are very similar symbologies, and there's a very guided line in which you can read this deck, but it's most of the time that will be the result of my reading. So I actually use this deck in a very intuitive way. So the Eight of Wands, for example, of course, it's got the element of movement, the element of speed. You know, the fact that it has a human figure in a card that traditionally doesn't have anything, it's a bit odd. And therefore, you know, it makes me focus my attention on the person, because this person is also breaking the fourth wall. It's looking directly at me. It's kind of asking me to interact, and therefore I see this as a journey, which is not necessarily the way in which I would read the Eight of Wands in any other deck. So this is what I mean by lifting me up. It's almost as if it were distracting me, but distracting, the verb to distract has kind of a different or a negative kind of connotation, and I don't mean it that way. I don't mean it in a negative way. I really appreciate this deck. It's really, really beautiful. So what the Dream Keepers does instead is actually makes me double down onto the meaning of the traditional cards. So in this case, the Four of Swords, even though it does share the same kind of aesthetics as the mystical moment, in the Dream Keepers it pushes me on a much deeper level of in understanding of the card itself in the traditional way. And that goes for pretty much every card. So it's something that I really like. It's something that I really appreciate, because this way, that's why to me, for example, using the mystical moments oracle, I can actually use it with the Dream Keepers tarot rather than the mystical moment tarot, because it will be more complete to me. The experience will be more complete. I love both of these decks. I don't think I prefer one over the other, to be honest, and there are differences, especially when we come to appreciate the saturation of the colors in the mystical moment. It's also due to the fact that the glossy finish will accentuate the saturation, whereas a matte will have the opposite effect. But if you look at this Eight of Wands here, for example, this Eight of Wands will not have the same effect as the Eight of Wands which just seen on the mystical moments. The mystical moments, the figure is looking at you, it's asking for a confrontation, it's asking for an interaction. The Eight of Wands is very focused on the meaning of the card. There is no request for interaction. It is a different take on the on a traditional Eight of Wands, but way it doesn't make you wander. It doesn't make your mind wander. And that's specifically what I mean when I talk about the differences of these two decks. So this deck takes me on a different journey. This deck instead wants me to focus on the cards. I really, really like these two. As a matter of fact, sometimes I actually use these two tarot decks together to give me a more complete perspective. So as we've seen, this is the Tarot of the Mystical Moment, and this is the Dream Keepers Tarot. These two decks are from the same author, the same illustrator at least, Corrado Roy. So if you watch my channel, you will know how much I love Corrado Roy. He is one of my favorite illustrators. He's Italian. He is the illustrator of many issues of the comic book Dylan Dog, which is my favorite one, and it's about It's a horror comic book. Corrado has been illustrating The Murder of Crows years ago, and just last year he's been illustrated The Dark Side of Tarot, which has come out, I think it was October or something like that, and I only just received it, so there is a bit of a story behind it, because what happened was that as soon as I saw it, I just needed it. I like his work so much that anything he does, I need to have. I'm a bit of a fan. So what happened, I saw it, I pre-ordered it, and on Book Depository, then it was, you know, the right time. Finally they started sending it out, but it was the Christmas time, and I just I never received it. And as a matter of fact, I received an email from the guys at Book Depository saying that it was very likely to have been lost, which broke my heart, because I really wanted it. And they were very nice to me. They said, okay, well, you know, we can try and find it and send it again, but it is likely, it is possible that it's gonna get lost because of the Christmas time. Or if you want, we can just give you a refund, or we can send you something else. And that's what I've done. I basically I think I bought something else. I don't remember exactly. That was a couple of months ago. But in any case, what happened was that I really felt like sooner or later I really wanted this tarot. And when I saw that it was on stock finally on Amazon Australia, I just got it, and the day after it was delivered, and it was just yesterday. So I have seen a lot of images of this deck. I have been going through the cards yesterday afternoon and this morning, and I'm really happy, because it does give me the exact same feeling that I was hoping for. So I'm actually showing you these two decks for this deck, so mirror or yin and yang decks. Why? These two decks share a very similar aesthetic, because the illustrator is Corrado, but they're actually quite different when it comes to energies. And I do believe that when one could possibly represent the yin, the other one is definitely representing the yang. But let's have a look at why I think that is. So these two decks have a different theme, as you can see. So the Murder of Crows, obviously it's a very dark theme deck. These are the backs, by the way. I think the size is, no, it's not. So the Murder of Crows is it's the same, it's just a stole, but it's slightly wider. These two decks, as you can tell, it's very easy to tell that they have been illustrated by the same person. It's got the same kind of features, the way in which he's painting these faces, for example, speaks to me of the same kind of art style. I personally really like it, probably because it looks familiar to me. It's something that I am very much used to look at, because many issues of Dylan Dog, as I said before, have Corrado Roy as an illustrator. But it's also because the Murder of Crows is probably one of my favorite decks when it comes to a very specific kind of dark reading. And I really like it. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the fact that the thematic of the crows is present in each and every card. Although cards have that particular sense that comes from the IWS. In the Murder of Crows, in the Dark Side of Tarot, it is definitely an RWS clone. So in the introduction of the book, for example, you will see that there's a bit of an explanation on how this deck came to be. It is definitely an RWS clone, although it does show you the same elements, a little bit less on the symbology to make it more simple to read, but it does show you everything on black and white and different shades of grey. And one very beautiful thing that I like about the guidebook is that it explains to you how white reflects the light, whereas black absorbs the light. And then it goes on explaining how white could be seen as the light and black could be seen as the darkness, because it's of its power of absorbing everything. And so it talks about shadow work. It talks about the way in which Jung was talking about shadow work, so the parts of ourselves that are hidden from the light. It talks about how to work with shadow work, in which way. I don't necessarily agree with everything that is written in the book. I think that some parts are very simplistic to the point of being simply wrong. And I do tend to get upset when I see something like that. So, but it's, you know, it's a guidebook, and obviously I'm very grateful of the fact that I can read this tarot even without reading the guidebook. I always read it anyway because I always want to participate in the creative process of the creator. But I am very aware that Corrado was only the illustrator and he had no part in writing the book. Because I do not necessarily agree with everything that is written in the book. What I do appreciate though is the fact that I can see where the concept is coming from. Why do we see black as a representative for the darkness? Why do we see white as the color that represents the light? It is a very important concept. I think it's one of those concepts that if you master it, then it will become part of your skills, and it will make it a lot easier also to read shadow work and to do any kind of work on shadow work. So the dark side of tarot to me is specifically very good at this kind of work, and I do recommend it for this particular let's say practice. When it comes to the murder occurs instead, I feel like there's a different kind of thematic, a different kind of feel to it, a different kind of energy. It comes from a very dark place, as you can see also from the expression on the faces of the characters in the card. And it stays there, whereas this one illuminates what's dark and brings it up to the surface in such a way that, as shadow work is supposed to do, it identifies the parts that were hidden, brings light to them, and it's up to you, the reader, or the person who's going through this process, to decide whether these parts should stay and be nurtured, or they can actually be released. Whereas the murder occurs to me is something that keeps me there. It doesn't necessarily provide me with the tools to do shadow work. And that's absolutely fine, because I don't need it to do it this way. I don't necessarily need all my tarot decks to be doing that kind of work for me, that kind of self-practice growth that I use the dark side of tarot for. So in this case, the Murder Occurs is a deck that I will use in the darker seasons. It's a deck that I will use, ironically, the darker seasons for me are July and August, because I live in the Southern Hemisphere. But what I mean with darker season is that the darkness of the soul. And I don't need to do that kind of bringing up into the light work. So this is a deck that it gives me the possibility to stay where I am whenever I identify some darker aspects of myself. I need to stay there sometimes. I don't know if it makes sense. I hope it does. But it's not necessary. It's not always necessary for me to do some kind of improvement. Sometimes I just need to be at peace with the darkness, and I need to leave it where it is, and I need to stay there as well. So this is what the Murder Occurs does for me. Whereas the dark side of tarot, after it just is encouraging me to do some work that I may eventually use them sequentially. So if I want to identify some darker feelings, for example, I will stay with the Murder Occurs for a while. And when I'm ready, then I will use the dark side of tarot in order to release or nurture the parts that have been brought back into the light. So I don't know whether you guys know these two decks. I don't necessarily see them display a lot on social media. I do believe that they are very beautiful, especially the Murder of Crows, because it does have the kind of different art style. I really do appreciate the fact that, for example, the Murder of Crows also has the kind of use of the shading to give a different tint to the cards. It's not necessarily just black and white, whereas the dark side of tarot does have that kind of dichotomy between the darkness and the light, which is exactly what the deck is for. So I understand the process, the creative process behind it. But this is the way I see these two decks. So we've seen the Murder of Crows and the Dark Side of Tarot, both of them illustrated by Corrado Roy. And again, having a look at tarot decks by the same author, by the same creator. So we've got the Macabre Tarot, which is the one that comes in a box which is shaped like a coffin, and the Penelope's Tarot, and they're both by Sam West or Sam Brook. I think she goes by Sam Brook now. I thought about this because I thought to myself, there couldn't be two more different decks. But it is true that these two decks have a very, very similar kind of artwork. And that is the meaning of this tag. That is the meaning of this video, in the sense that, there's authors that are so creative, they are so good, that can actually keep the same art style, but create two completely different decks. And that's what I wanted to show you by showing you these two in comparison. So Sam has got a very distinct art style. She's the author of other decks. For example, I've got the Rainbow Moon Tarot, which I really like. I'm not a fan of the cardstock. And I know that the Penelope Star is actually coming mass market. This is the indie edition, but it's coming mass market, published by Rockpool, I think. She may have an exclusivity contract with Rockpool, but the name is going to be different. I think it's going to be called Velouria. I'm not entirely sure, but I've seen it. I've seen news about it somewhere. The Macabre Tarot is this edition is the mass market edition. Anyway, I always really like the backs of Sam's decks. I mean, look at this. It's a work of art on the backs as well to me. That's clearly something that took a lot of work, a lot of imagination to create, especially the one from the Macabre Tarot. And they're really beautiful. So as I said, she's got a very distinct art style, very easy to recognize, very easy to spot, echoes and references between these two decks. Obviously, because they are thematically different, you will see the presence of bones and skulls. It is called the Macabre Tarot, obviously, whereas the Penelope Tarot is much more kind. And I think at the end of the day, this is what makes these two decks very different decks. And they definitely occupy a very distinct and different place in my collection and in my practice. These are decks that I really use quite often. They are both on my desk. Even though you would think that the Macabre Tarot is something that we use during the darker months, but it's actually something that I really feel attracted to the whole year. And I think that, I don't think I need to talk a lot about the differences in these decks and the way that they both embody a very powerful energy, for sure, a very evocative kind of energy, but a very different energy nonetheless. So we've got a confrontational kind of energy that we can identify with the Macabre Tarot, whereas when it comes to the Penelope Tarot, what I feel is a very watery energy, it's a very sentimental kind of energy, an emotional one, but it's not the emotional of, because the Macabre Tarot gives you a lot of emotions as well. But it's a confronting kind of emotion, whereas it's a comforting kind of emotion that comes from the Penelope. I mean, confronting for sure. If you have a thing for eyes, like my husband could not look at this card because it does have a thing for eyes, and comforting. And we're still talking about daggers, which is funny because the traditional name of this suit is the suit of swords. Daggers is just, you know, it's a shorter kind of sword, so it's not a major deviation from the word swords. However, I do like it that she's consistently renaming the suit of swords as daggers. So we got two cards from the same suit. However, this one is very strong and powerful and confrontational. It's also because the Five of Swords, or the Five of Daggers, is the card of, to me, it's the card of gaslighting. So you're being put one against the other because of the third person profiting from that kind of conflict. And the King of Daggers in this case is the scientist or the expert. That's the way I read the archetype of the King of Daggers, the King of Swords. But as you can see, there is this same element of the suit, but it's a completely different feel to it. There's light in this card, there's powerful acceptance, there's recognition, there's awareness, whereas obviously there's darkness in this one. And it's not just because of the fact that, you know, the Five of Swords is a very specific card, obviously. But as you can see, I mean, we've got cards like the Temperance card in this case that is still very confrontational. And, you know, it's very typical of this deck. Whereas, for example, the Six of Daggers, which could be confrontational because it's the journey you embark upon to go from one place to the other, and you know that it's going to be a better place for you, but you're not necessarily happy about having to go into this journey. But it's still very comforting to me. It feels like there is this kind of gentleness to the deck. So I really like these two decks. I think that Sam's work is exceptionally good, even though in many cases there is a lot of simplicity. But mind you, it's the kind of simplicity that points to mastery of the elements, of the symbology on the deck. One thing is to produce or create a tarot deck that is very pippish or pip. Even the Seven of Wands, for example, it does give you immediately that sense of standing up for your own rights. And this figure she's frowning, and that to me is expressing the major effort, you know, of standing up for what you believe in against everyone else. And it also, the Two of Bones, for example, from the Macabre Tarot, is very pippish as well, as you can tell, but it still conveys that kind of energy that you see in this card. So as I was saying, one thing is, you know, producing or creating a pippish deck where the person has to remember the meaning of the cards. And one thing is actually making it so that it's very conducive of intuition into the meaning of the cards. But these two decks, they could not be more different, and yet again they are very similar. It's just probably two different sides of the cards when it comes to the interpretation, and of course the depiction as well. Coincidentally, whenever I see these two decks together, I think that they actually pair up quite well. I really like them together as well. I wish Sam would make an oracle deck. I would definitely buy it, because I believe that because of this such a distinct art style, it would actually pair up really well with other her tarot decks as well. So this is the Penelope Tarot, and this is the Macabre Tarot. So this has become a very long video, so I think I'm gonna stop here for now. This is going to be part 1 of this tag. So these decks have been selected by me as to be mirror decks or yin and yang decks, and it's a VR to Meredith from the Oasis Spiritual Empowerment Tarot.